All right, we'll go ahead and begin. And for those that are just joining, welcome to another edition of Berkeley Boost, Berkeley Law Executive Education's free platform for CLE webinars and more. Today, we're discussing the Public Benefit Corporation. I was proud to co-author a case study published by Berkeley Law Executive Education on Veeva Systems, the first public company to convert to a public benefit corporation. We'll be joined by some special guests, including the General Counsel of Veeva Systems. But before we do, just some house cleaning items and other things. For those practicing attorneys that are seeking MCLE credit, I know you have a deadline coming up soon. This webinar has been approved for 1 hour of credit. For those from other states, your certification may vary, but if you fill out our Google form, we have the link on the screen. We'll also be putting it in the chat box. We will send you a certificate of attendance, and you're welcome to work with your local bar on using the certificate of attendance for this, for CLE credit in your state, and we believe that works in most states. If you have any questions about this or anything else related to this webinar or executive education at Berkeley Law, you can email us at executive@law.berkeley.edu. We've got some exciting programs coming up in executive education. Our core leadership and management course returns in April 2022. In just a couple of months, applications are now open. Leadership in the legal profession. It's a dynamic 10-week business school style management course that's live, but utilizing the Minerva form. Think kind of a supercharged Zoom for learning, and you can participate from home or office. I got to take the pilot course 2 years ago, and it's grown substantially. It's really phenomenal for you or anyone on your team that would like some more training around leadership and management. Now, this case study on Veeva Systems was developed for 2 of our executive courses, Sustainable Capitalism and ESG Online, and then our board version of that course, which we do with series, called ESG Navigating the Board's Role. Both of those courses return in the next couple of months. They are fully online, almost exclusively self-paced, although they're supplemented with live office hours. Just really phenomenal courses. Both have had hundreds of participants over the past couple of years. Professor Amelia Miazad, who's joining us today and is the faculty director for these courses, was just in the studio this week updating much of the material for these courses. So it's a really great time to check these out and consider registering today. We'll put the link up for both of these courses in the chat. And since we're online watching TV a bit here, we're going to play an actual trailer to kick things off for our Sustainable Capitalism and ESG Online course. So I will play that now, then we will return with our regularly scheduled program and our Berkeley Boost discussion of becoming a public benefit corporation.
Capitalism is at a crucial juncture today. The pandemic, racial injustice, rising income inequality, and climate change are only heightening the demand for capitalism to take account of its stakeholders. But precisely how companies can meet this growing demand remains unclear. Our course addresses that challenge and demonstrates how companies can embed environmental and social issues into their business and investment strategies. Sustainable Capitalism and ESG includes lectures which introduce the theoretical underpinnings of corporate purpose and explores the crossroads we are at today. Perhaps ironically, the Supreme Court's broader articulation of corporate purpose has accelerated the trend of brand activism. In this module, we will address and debate the following questions. Under Delaware corporate law, are directors permitted or even required to consider stakeholders beyond shareholders? Through interviews with ESG thought leaders, the course examines how companies are putting stakeholder governance into practice. Curated readings introduce students to the most cutting-edge research on ESG, and discussion forums provide an opportunity to engage with their peers on the emerging topics of the times. As one of the leading public institutions in the world, helping the business community address social and environmental challenges is part of UC Berkeley's public mission. Join the discussion and debate today and help chart the future of sustainable capitalism.
All right, thank you. So now we will begin our scheduled program. I'll introduce our first guest. You know her from the trailer for Sustainable Capitalism and ESG Online, Professor Amelia Miazad. And I'm also joined by really a trailblazer in this space and someone that we wouldn't be able to have this program without her incredible work, Susan McCormick, who is a partner at Morrison Foerster, also an advisory board member of the Berkeley Center for Law and Business, among many, many other things. So Amelia and Suze, welcome to today's Berkeley Boost.
Thank you, Adam.
So, Susan, I'm going to start with you, and maybe you can give us a bit of a history lesson here, because you were instrumental in passing California's public benefit statute, and you can tell us more about that. But more generally, obviously, ESG has become it's always been a hot topic, but we've seen it really elevate from kind of niche conferences, folks who focus on this work, to board level discussions, shareholder meetings, et cetera. And so kind of why do we care about corporate forum as part of this conversation on ESG and sustainability?
Well, I think we care about corporate forum really because the forum is the scaffolding that goes around our companies, private and public companies. And, we can debate whether it's right or wrong, but companies are one of the most powerful forces for good and bad, in the world today. And if you think of the corporate forum as the scaffolding, for a long time in corporate law, other than the advent of the LLC, there was not a lot of shifting other than, in terms of tax rules and possibly the LLC and a move more to sort of shareholder rights and a belief in that the corporation's primary role is to advance the pecuniary interest in shareholders, which I don't hold, but there's that whole movement. The interesting thing is, starting around 2010, we really started to see real innovation. Just to give you 2 seconds of history, 2006, B Labs was formed, and B Labs started as they did a fabulous job, but a certification. You monitor and then you self-report, which it is today. And B Corps is just a certification element. But after they formed, they started saying, well, anybody can say anything, right? If you form a company and become a B Corp, unless you have something in your charter, unless you have some stick or way of really making sure that mission that you're saying publicly you're doing is in your charter, to kind of avoid greenwashing. So what they did first is they went to states that had constituency statutes, and I won't go into all of constituency statutes, but they said, hey, in these states, we can actually put an affirmative obligation, possibly to this benefit purpose. That it came to California. A bunch of us objected for other reasons. And then we started drafting the first of the new corporate forums. And then really from 2010 until now, there has been a plethora of new forms state by state. I think generally we have coalesced around what in California is the SPC, in Delaware is the Public Benefit Corporation, which we're going to be talking about today, where really a board and management agree with their shareholders what their public benefit will be embedded in the charters. And then they do have a dual fiduciary duty. So the difference between these types of companies and a normal company could focus on these things, these public benefits. There's nothing that stops any of our companies from doing it other than possibly, shareholder returns. However, these forms, the public benefit, the board and management are required. They have an affirmative fiduciary duty to the public benefit.
And we'll learn a bit about
the history in 30 seconds.
I love it. Wonderful. And we'll learn a bit about why Veeva Systems was interested in shifting from being able to have this multi-stakeholder or dual fiduciary focus to requiring themselves to have that. But Suze, from your perspective, if companies are able to do these things without modifying their corporate form and their fiduciary duties, why would they do it?
Why will they do it? Well, there's a lot more to it. I've sort of boiled it down to an easy bite-sized sentence to explain it, but they're really, if you become a public benefit corporation, you really are required to embed the public benefit, not just in your reporting, but really in your operations and your decision-making, both in the ordinary course and in change of control. So it may be that in Veeva's case, in some companies, they're doing it anyway, but they're holding themselves accountable. And the second is really that accountability piece, the requirement to measure and benchmark and then report out on it in a way that at some point we'll see the SEC move, but right now is required by statute. And so it is a fiduciary duty. I think I'll talk later after Veeva about really the two different flavors of PBC, but in most cases right now, there's an overlap between how the companies are functioning and their public benefit.
Great. Now, thanks, Suze. Amelia, can you just step back for a minute and talk us through us a bit about kind of what you're seeing? I mean, just the kind of how these issues have risen to the board level, the shareholder level. Most folks are probably familiar with Larry Fink's letter, the Business Roundtable, but just tell us about how far we've come in the last few years on these topics.
Yeah, sure. If I may, I'm going to take just a quick detour from that to, I just want to emphasize that everything that I've learned about public benefit corporations and ESG, for that matter, was inspired by Suze McCormick. She taught social enterprise law over a decade ago, and that class is what really caused me to appreciate the transformation of corporate purpose. She not only saw PBCs and ESG decades before the rest of the legal and academic community, but I'm especially excited and to have Suze on this call predict what is going to be innovative in 2030 and beyond. So maybe we can save a little bit of time because PBCs are quite innovative, but I know that Suze in her practice is playing with corporate form in very creative ways. And we now co-teach social enterprise law. So I'm really excited to hear about that. But to answer your question about shareholders, I study large asset managers and shareholders of large public companies. And they're seeing ESG as a proxy for risk oversight. And so why would over 99% of Veeva's shareholders who are large asset managers agree to this transition to a public benefit corporation? Because public benefit corporations are stakeholder oriented, and thus the investors believe they will have more long-term growth because of the risk mitigation aspects of listening to your stakeholders. So that's why I think that the shareholders are on board. Now, that being said, we've seen a lot of shareholder proposals asking companies, many of them filed by Shareholder Commons, our friend Rick Alexander, asking companies to transition to, or asking the board to consider transitioning to a public benefit corporation. And interestingly, we have not had the large asset managers vote in favor of those proposals. Now, why? Well, I asked them why. I asked a couple of them why off the record. And what they said is they don't want to vote for things that are not brought to them by the board itself. So in Veeva's case, Peter, the CEO, did quite a bit of work with the shareholder community to bring them along, months of work. Whereas shareholders are not inclined to vote at this point for these proposals because they're not initiated by the corporation.
Amelia. So my one final question, and then we'll bring on our special guests from Veeva Systems and talk a bit more about the Veeva Systems experience. But can maybe both of you discuss how really this has become, if this is the right word, but more mainstream over the past few years? I mean, Suze, your career has been, you're a corporate lawyer doing, hardcore M&A and capital markets work. And just how you both have seen this rise, for example, I mean, Veeva Systems, this was a software company that adopted this. And so it's not simply kind of niche companies or folks that are interested in this. Why has this become such a relevant issue in boardrooms and in the eyes of shareholders, not just from a doing the right thing, saving the world perspective, but from a capturing value for the corporation perspective.
I'll give you my perception. Exactly. So this started as like at the firm, I started focusing on it in 2001, and even my partners were like, oh, that's that good stuff that Suze does on the side. So it really started as pro bono, as the purview. Some of the first people that I started working with corporate forums were really philanthropy. They were out for impact. They'd realized that giving money away, wasn't working for them in terms of having impact. And so they started playing with structures. It has gone, it then went to sort of the niche market, and now it is mainstream. There are 15 publicly traded PBCs, up from, 2 years ago, there was one in terms of laureate. There are a myriad of others, maybe 100 waiting in the wings. It is being discussed in M&A context. The PBC is considered a sweet pill. And we can talk about what that means for M&A as another mechanism for defense, and it's defense to ensure that the positive impact survives M&A. So it's really an exciting time. And I'd love to turn it over to Amelia, because why now? The acceleration in the last 2 years has just, I would start talking about corporate form, and 2 years ago, people's eyes would glaze over. And now people actually want to talk to me about it. It's crazy. But it's really a confluence of many things. It's a confluence of consumers. It's a confluence of a generational shift. It is shareholders. But importantly, we have some huge issues like climate and inequality. They can't be solved with philanthropic capital, less than 0.5% of the capital markets. And so the old, oh my God, I'm going to make money and then I will give a little bit away on the side. Another public company is like 1% for the planet. That 1% for the planet is a fabulous organization, but the one, just tithing 1%, it just won't solve any of these problems. And so what people are increasingly looking at is saying, okay, those problems could impact the bottom line of our company itself. So we're actually going to start embedding this M&A in the operations of the company itself. Amelia?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We've moved from, values to value. And so we still have values-based, traditional sustainability investors interested in ESG because it is the right thing to do. But we increasingly investors recognize that these are risks, and they are risks because of a whole confluence, sort of a perfect storm. But a big part of that we're seeing more and more, which is concerning to both me and Suze, and we've talked about this a lot, is a loss of faith in the public sector and a blurring of the line between what businesses are responsible for and what the government is responsible for. And I think that the PBC movement is also a part of that. It enables businesses to be more pro-social, but at the margins, I worry about that because it sort of there are some things that only government can do.
Thanks. So now we're going to get into the weeds a bit and bring on our special guest, Josh Faddis, who is a Senior Vice President and the General Counsel and Corporate Secretary at Veeva Systems, which was the subject of our case study. I put the case study link in the chat box. I'm sure everyone has received that already. We've made it freely available. If you have gone to business school, you know that most schools charge for their case studies. We have not. We want everyone to read it, to use it in their classes. We've already been contacted by a number of other academic institutions. So I'm really excited to see this case study getting a lot of use. I also want to
including Adam, a really terrible one.
Yeah, our frenemies in the South Bay, they're already using it down there, so we love that. And I want to give a shout out to someone in the audience, Dixon Louie, who is our case study co-author. Hi, Dixon. Thanks for joining us today. Also, I will say we'll do Q&A at the end. I see there's some really great questions already coming through the chat box and the Q&A. So send those and we'll spend time with those at the end. So Josh, well, first, welcome back, I think, to BerkeleyBoosts. And thanks again for all of your time and contributions, not just to the process of converting, but also to the case study and to Berkeley.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone on the call for taking an interest in Veeva's story and in the PBC movement, if I can say that, if that's not too strong of a term.
No,
really we be here.
I love it. And so Josh, we probably have mostly lawyers on the call. We are a law school, and I'm wondering if you can maybe start by telling us. So it's been about a year or just over a year since Veeva officially converted from a Delaware C Corp to a Delaware Public Benefit Corporation. Tell us a bit about the story from your perspective as general counsel of the company.
Yeah, so in the case study, there was this quintessential moment that is the hike that our CEO went on with our chairman to make the decision to move the discussion of PBC to the full board and really engage on a potential conversion. My involvement actually started, pre-hike. There's this period started, 2016, 2017, that was really a period of sort of discovery and awareness. And what we were thinking about at the time was, we've got this very committed set of values that is pervasive across the company. And those are do the right thing, customer success, employee success, and speed. And those have been part of the company's value system for a long time. So we were thinking about ways to communicate to our employee base primarily, how do we do things differently that reflect those values? What's unique about the way that we operate? And so we were coming up with this, what we called at the time, a corporate citizenship statement to include on our website. And it is really in that process that I discovered, frankly, that the PBC form even existed. And that started what I'd refer to as just an idea partnership between our CEO and a few board members, and just learning and understanding, could this be, what does this PBC form mean? What would the conversion process like? Could this be something we are interested in? And that lasted for about, a year and a half or so. So that was sort of, if I think about our journey in phases, that's the pre-hike phase. Then we started to have deeper discussions with our board. And my concern at that time as general counsel was making sure that our board was equipped to make a good decision. Because if you think about, unique to maybe, and there have been a couple of conversions now, but at the time we were the first, we needed to conclude that conversion was as a traditional C Corp at the time. We needed to conclude that converting was in the best interest of our shareholders. So that was a really serious decision. We thought about risk and benefits, and we involved outside advisors. And then once we got over that threshold, we thought about how do we communicate with our investors and what would be the best way to communicate with our investors. And it was really important to us that we didn't try to sort of ram the decision through, that we got feedback from our investors. And that was even against some advice that we got from some people that we spoke to who said, bundle this on the proxy and go for the vote and maybe you'll narrowly get it. We decided to announce publicly that we were considering this decision, so we could have real conversations. And in those conversations, we had a board member on each call. We had typically our CFO or another representative from finance. We had IR, and then I was on all of those. And I hope that this is that the environment has changed a little bit since that time. But I'll tell you, at that time, and part of my role, because we were talking to typically both portfolio managers and governance voting office types from the big funds. And we tried to talk to all of our top 20 and covered most of those. But their awareness of PBC, I'll just tell you a funny story. One of the portfolio managers came on the call, and before we even started speaking, he had handwritten on a piece of paper this little sign that said "Proud of Veeva," right? So the reactions were from that on one end of the spectrum to PB what? I've never heard of this. I have no idea what you're talking about. Are you trying to become a nonprofit? Literally just had never heard the term. So, part of my role was education, really, with that group. And then, having listened, gotten their feedback, understood what was important to our investors, we did decide to move forward. And then I would say the next phase that I would characterize as the SEC communication phase. And for those who are on the call who might be considering a conversion, I hope that we greased the skids a little bit. I will say it was more involved, and I'll just say maybe slightly more skeptical than we might have thought. If you are considering a conversion, you have a chance to look at our proxy for our special meeting. You'll see it's 4 or 5 pages of text, but the SEC was really deeply concerned about disclosing risk and potential conflicts between our investors and other stakeholders, which we really don't view this and didn't view this at the time, still don't, as creating any material conflicts if you think about the long term and building a durable business. But then I'd say the last phase, which may be a little unusual for the general counsel role, has been involvement in media outreach and press and just being available to other outlets to try to educate the broader market, which frankly is not something I ever thought I would be doing, but I've done a fair amount of it now, and it's been fun.
You're doing it now. Thanks, Josh. And so definitely encourage folks to take a look at the case study, which covers all of this in detail. Josh, one theme in the case study, and I think this relates to a question I had asked Susan, Amelia, and something I've asked you before. My background is in venture capital, and I incorporated hundreds of startups during my the time I practiced, and there was this mantra in the Valley: innovate your business models, not your legal structures. And so I'm sure you heard, whether it was from outside counsel or other advisors, this is nice and great that you're pursuing these multi-stakeholder interests, but you don't have to do this. Like, you don't have to be a trailblazer here. And so can you talk a bit about that and kind of your response to that? And I know this is something that you internalized.
Yeah, no, we really felt, and really, frankly, this is really driven by our CEO. He was never comfortable with the idea that we had a legal purpose that was potentially out of alignment with our values and how we ran the company, because we really did. And we think most companies that are trying to solve big problems and working for the long term, they're not just thinking about shareholder results. So we looked at it not as a change in how we operate the company, but better alignment with our legal purpose in how we have always run the company. That makes us more durable over the long term. And then we're able to talk about that. And it helps our conversation with, for those of you who don't know that much about Veeva, we sell to one industry. So we sell to broadly the life sciences industry, which is pharmaceutical, medical device, biotechnology. And we're asking them to use our systems for some of their most critical processes, like clinical trial processes and pharmacovigilance, so monitoring safety results and their communications with doctors. So those are big long-term commitments. So for those customers to know that we are committed to the industry, we think of the industry as a customer. We work for the benefit of the industry overall, not just our customers. And for our employees to know that we're committed to them and creating a great work environment and not overly restricting them and making them sign non-competes outside of California and all these other practices that we disagree with, helps us over the long term. And we can do those things with more certainty as a PBC than we could before we converted.
Josh, I'm going to put up a slide here for a minute. This is from your special proxy for the shareholder meeting in support of the conversion. So let me just do this quickly, and I think this should be helpful because I want to just go over this. I thought this was a really nice framing. Can you see that, the pros and cons?
Yep, I see that.
And so, Josh, a year later, looking back, what's life been like as a public benefit corporation, and maybe highlighting some of these pros and cons? This was, this is from over a year ago, but what has come true, what hasn't?
Yeah, I'd say the most interesting pro that is not on this list.
I love it. More pros.
Because we didn't expect it, is that it's been an additional source of ideas. So if you think about in the pre-PBC world, before we talked about ourselves in this way with our employees, we were thinking about products that could have the success in the market. And now, sometimes an idea for a product or a problem we can solve may come from a different direction. It may come from, well, is this consistent with our purpose of making for instance, clinical development process overall better. And that may be an idea that also works commercially. So it's interestingly resulted in additional idea generation, which we didn't expect, frankly. I think it has helped with employee engagement and attrition, which we're facing just like everyone else in the world. And maybe most importantly, it has put us on the radar for a group of employees that might not have considered Veeva otherwise. So it's made us maybe more attractive to a group of, or to a type of employee or potential employee that might not have considered us otherwise. And it has also allowed us to have longer term, higher level discussions with our customers, which is those first two, if my eyes are not failing me, those are sort of the key points. And those have actually happened. It hasn't changed the way we make decisions. We still vet decisions against our values. But we do that more confidently now because those values are now exactly consistent with our legal duties.
Yeah, it's interesting on that. As part of the case study, we interviewed a few employees. This didn't all make it into the case study, but there's something called the cocktail party test, where are employees excited to talk about where they work at a cocktail party? And I think that's something a lot of companies struggle with. And so, and speaking to your employees, we kind of asked them this question, and it was something that they were, yeah, when I talk about where I work, I mentioned this idea of us being a public benefit corporation. And these were engineers and sales folks that we spoke to. So that was really neat to see. Josh, obviously, if it was all pros and no cost, everyone would do this, and maybe they will one day. But highlighted here are some cons, and I think you've expressed some others. But can you talk a bit about some of the costs and why this wasn't as simple as just making a filing?
I think the biggest potential con was really just the unknown. Maybe Susan can comment about this too. I'm sure she knows far more than me. But there's just the model was just untested. There have been limited or no lawsuits, although we took a lot of comfort from the fact that as long as directors are independent and not conflicted, that all of the jurisprudence on the business judgment rule in Delaware is still applicable as a PBC. So that was important for us, and we thought about it. We haven't really seen any of the negatives come to fruition, and we are. Obviously we have a little more burden in thinking about our PBC reporting obligation, and we have ended up adding some headcount. But at scale, that's not really a significant expense. So I got to tell you, Adam, we weighed the cons, we thought about the cons, but we haven't really seen any of those come to fruition as a PBC.
Okay, Josh, last question for you, and then we'll bring back the full group, let them comment, and then take questions. Advice for other general counsels who may be on this call and may, whether it's they're hearing murmurs from their board, their executives, or they think this is something the company might be interested. Kind of advice on where to get started.
Yeah, so first I would just say be open-minded. This is not this can be completely consistent if you're already a public C Corp. This can be completely consistent with, and I think it is over the long term, with generating shareholder results. So don't think it's some the trade-off between the obligation you've always had to people who are putting their faith in you for their retirement fund. That's not what the ask is. So I'd say first, don't be afraid of it, and you probably will hear this from some. You probably will over time get some questions from your board members. I'd say be open-minded. I would say also, you got to think really deeply about purpose and whether your company is at a stage that it can really commit to a lasting purpose. Because once you decide on that thing, you got to live with it, unless you want to go out to shareholders for a change. So that's important. So if you are a 2-year-old startup that's in the pivoting and adjusting and bobbing and weaving stages of your company's life, you may not be ready to do that. If you're a year out from your IPO or you've been operating for a while and you have a very, very clear mission that's been consistent, it may actually, you may find the same thing as us, which is that it's complementary. But it's a little bit like a marriage. it's better to get married once if you can navigate that. And same thing with the purpose. So you really do have to think about it. And then I would say, make sure that you've got to be operating in a multi-stakeholder way. Your operations really have to be consistent with the legal obligation. If you're not ready to do that, or that's not how the company operates, then I would say don't convert. I think many of you actually already do operate in that fashion. If you do, then you have very little to be concerned about. And then I guess the fourth thing I would say is, and we found this to be really useful, if you can, if you're already public and you're thinking about a conversion, and you can set up a process that allows you to have open conversation with your shareholders first, that's really valuable. And you may find that they have a concern about some other aspect of your corporate governance. Maybe you know that maybe some of you know that we got rid of our classified board when we adopted the PBC, and that was meaningful to some of our shareholders. So maybe things like that you'll learn from talking with your shareholders before you put it in front of them for a vote. So I think that's a really helpful and healthy way to approach it.
Thanks, Josh. Well, appreciate that one-on-one. I'm going to bring Suze and Amelia back. I'll start going through these phenomenal questions. Again, I put the link for attorneys that want CLE credit in the chat. Also, again, put the link to actually download the Veeva Systems case study, which we're referencing today. We also produced a really nice 8-minute video interviewing the CEO, Peter Gassner, and others. So check that out on the webpage. But Suze, we'll turn to you. Kind of thoughts. What's the significance of Veeva Systems being the first public company to convert? And any comments? I know Josh called you out there, but I'll turn the floor over to you.
No, I thought it was really interesting that the internal process to become a PBC and what resonated, where some people are like, yeah, welcome to the party, welcome to the pool, the water's warm. And a lot of people, until recently, when I would go with structures and we were working with the big money people in New York, I mean, they really were like, go back to California in your Birkenstocks, little girl, we're all about making money here. Don't you understand how the capital markets work? And I really think there has been a sea change. And I really think Veeva is part of that. It's showing that in the public, not before Veeva, everybody else who'd become a PBC in the markets, they were a PBC before they went in. They have demonstrated, and then in the public capital markets, the institutional investors are desperate for companies that are looking more long-term at building value. They're looking for companies that are considering stakeholders, so they don't end up, as Facebook, the poster child for not considering all of the ramifications. They're looking for companies that are innovative. And one of the things Josh intimated, but as a PBC at the board and at management level, there is an incentive, there is a premium on looking around corners, on seeing what's coming, on prioritizing. I mean, when I talk about climate now, I'm like, cyber, nobody was talking about cyber and privacy 15 years ago. And now, of course, it's number one on the compliance list for most companies. Climate is the same. And what the PBC form does for companies like Veeva is really encourage or require the creativity to say, okay, we really need to be thinking about how our company is going to be operating long-term and considering these factors. Also, I'll just say this answers a couple of the questions, Adam, as well. So Veeva, so first of all, within corporate form, Amelia knew I was going to do this. A B Corp is a certification. There is a lot of work. When you tell me what's coming on, there's a ton of work that is being done on measuring and certifying. They're one. I'm following for public companies, obviously what's happening with IFRS, but then there's the benefit corporation, which in most states is very different from the PBC. And then there is the PBC. And what Josh said about framing the public benefit in your charter is key. I will also say, in response to the question, there are two questions. One, about can institutional investors invest? And for those, there's actually QIC, which is a large pension in Australia, has a very good article because I helped generate generate capital where they're invested, become a public company, a PBC. And for many of those large institutional investors, this is the first time they'd invested in a PBC. But within the PBC, there are two distinct flavors. There is the Veeva flavor, and most of the flavors for companies that are out there where there is overlap between their public benefit and how they operate, the goods and services they provide, anyway. So how they framed it is critical. There is also the potential for a PBC where there is a complete offset. The question about energy companies. An energy company could say our public benefit is climate, in which case, again, back to what Josh said, huge difference between a benefit corporation, say in New York or California, and the PBC is that the benefit corporation has increased risk. I can talk about it. The PBC does afford boards and management the same protection as the business judgment rule. So if you're not breaching other duties, you can make that trade-off. So you can say, I'm actually going to take a hit in terms of my revenue, and as in the short term, to focus on the public benefit of climate. So that's important. If you have a mandate to just be return first, if you are large pension institutional, you really should make sure you are focused on the public benefit, as Josh has described it, not just for their internal purposes. You don't want to change it and want to make sure it works, but that is going to dictate kind of how, basically the valuation, how the company is going to function and generate returns, because there is no offset in Josh's model between returns and their public benefit. But you can have a PBC, an energy company that is in the business of traditional oil and gas, as a public benefit, and then their boards and management are to some extent protected from liability when they focus on really the energy transition. And that if you ask me at the end, that's one of the things I will say I think is to come.
Is this what you meant? I mean, is this where that idea of you refer to it as a sweet pill, Suze, comes in? I mean, is there a fear here that this could provide a defense and water down the board's fiduciary obligations if they're accountable to more, are they accountable to less kind of idea here?
Well, that's a separate issue. This is just in the operation. Somebody's suing because their stock price drops because they're in oil and gas and they're focused on energy transition and carbon sequestration and renewables and taking actions that have considerable capital expenditures, but will hurt the bottom line for some period of time. So that's I'm just talking about normal operations. In the ordinary course, yes, the term sweet pill, Josh, and I'd love to hear Josh's views, but Josh and his board, if they're entertaining offers, there is first the question of if somebody lobs in an unsolicited bid, if you're a PBC, is that required to start a process? And number two, and the answer is probably not, but the answer number two is, must the board consider the public benefit as part of the sale process? In other words, could they take an offer that is lower in price if the higher price is not going to maintain the public benefit? And the answer to that question is Leo Strine would violently say yes. I think there are many of us who have a question about whether or not at some price point you would need to go back to your shareholders with a possible recommendation to convert out of the PBC. That's also an open question. But going back to something else that Josh said, there is no case law yet. So the PBC, the benefit corporation in most states is not that well drafted. There is going to be litigation, and most of the companies are going to be in bad shape. The BBC is, and I commend Morris Nichols, and it was actually Rick Alexander and the drafters, and those of us who put together the SBC, is designed, it's designed for the public capital markets. It's designed, but it hasn't been tested. And so I think another thing that we will see is, we're at an all-time high tide. As Warren Buffett said, you don't know people are swimming naked till the tide goes out. The tide is going to go out in the capital markets. So, a lot of this will be tested. And when investors are losing money and they need to have some way to recoup, do we start having claims? And exactly from Josh's slide, this offsetting, it's like, okay, is there an offsetting? Are you protecting yourself, the board and management, and things that may not lead to improvements in the bottom line? That was a long-winded ramble, but
let me just quickly say that the issue of, in particular, what the implications of being a PBC would be in a Revlon situation is something that the SEC specifically warrant us to address in our proxy, and it is. So I do agree with what you said, that with the strong position, and you'll see that reflected in our proxy. So if folks want to see how we handled that, have a look at our special meeting proxy.
Yeah, but I do.
Just to circle back, because I think it's important, but do you think also, I mean, even in the ordinary course, I mean, is this a defense against, the stock price dropping, just again, by being, I guess, in defense of here, if I'm making a defense of shareholder capitalism, or is share price the best proxy we have for value? And then if we expand our view here, are we watering it down and just allowing companies, is this just diluting the corporate purpose?
That is,
Well,
Leo and I spoke for the New York Bar Association, and that was exactly, then professor at Harvard, that was the debate we had with Jill Fish. Amelia, why don't you address that? Sorry.
No, what I wanted to say is this is a question, this is really the heart of the difference between the California form and the Delaware Public Benefit Corporation, and Suze can speak to that, but there are trade-offs, and Veeva has not and hopefully will not have to face those, but if it does face a trade-off, there is risk, and there's more risk in the California Public Benefit Corporation than there is in the Delaware form. And Suze, I know that during the pandemic, a lot of companies that you advised faced these trade-offs for the first time. And so I wanted you to sort of emphasize that and maybe weigh in on that when there are and this is one of the questions as well. There are trade-offs between shareholders and stakeholders sometimes, and that does raise the specter of liability.
Well, let me just clarify something else that I know Veeva got right, because yes, I have read your your filings, Josh, because I'm that kind of crazy woman on corporate forum. I'm like Pavlov's dog. Anyway, you have the board and management, in addition to it is really all about the public benefit, as Josh says, framing your public benefit, because that is where your fiduciary duty is to that public benefit. In addition, the board and management must consider stakeholders, but they don't have a fiduciary duty to stakeholders other than shareholders. So I don't see as much risk with the PBC there. I do see where the litigation is going to come, and it's got to be tested, is I would bet initially in a change of control situation where where a board decides to take a lower price because they believe that company A, who has a higher price, is not going to maintain the public benefit, and company B is going to do a better job. And it's going to be those nuances. I also think, when we have a couple companies in the public markets that are offsetting, the energy company that focuses on climate, I mean, somebody's going to challenge, how you are weighting, because there is no case law or guidance around that weighting. I will say we're just talking about the public benefit, which is the same as the social purpose in California. The benefit corporation in many states like California and New York actually has a third-party enforcement proceeding and does not provide for the same protection as the business judgment rule for boards and management in making decisions. It is one of the reasons why most companies, if they were a benefit, there are a lot of other reasons. In addition to the fact, I would bet that most companies will convert to a Delaware PBC prior to going public, or if they are like Veeva and converting, just because the risk is considerably increased with the benefit corporation. I feel like I'm rambling, but
no, you're doing great, because you're also answering many of our questions.
I've been kind of reading through the questions and trying to
address
at the same time. There was a really good questions on metrics and measurement. The answer to that, with the IFRS setting up the ISSB, I am hopeful, although I had a conversation with CalPERS because GRI is not part of it, I am hopeful that we will get to a point soon where really measuring, benchmarking, and reporting in a way so that Josh is right now, Josh is going to figure out what standards are best. And, you have 2 years from conversion to come out with your report. But there is not the robust measurement system as there is for financial returns. And so I think that needs to evolve the same way corporate form evolves. I'd love to hear Josh or Amelia talk about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, with the SEC is certainly poised to mandate disclosure and seems to be coming up with a version of its own metrics, borrowing seems to be mostly from TCFD and SASB, which is good because that's what the investor community has embraced. But I think in a year from now, we're going to have a very quick evolution of those standards just because we've seen, a lot of investor demand, frankly.
And actually, let me just add that what you've seen in the public markets, which have had incredible demand, billions of dollars of what are called performance-linked bonds or SDG-linked bonds. So all of a sudden, Josh is going to raise money in the capital markets, and he has to pay less interest when he shows a certain amount of, good work done with his employee base and good work doing in the community and reduction of emissions. Like, I'm going to make less money as a bank. I'm going to make darn sure, that Josh is going to prove out and really measure and show me that he has engaged in that behavior to get the benefit.
So lots of questions. I'm trying to see what is still open. Question just on given the growing importance of companies as social and political actors, Professor Miazad, you referenced this earlier. Do you all think at some point in the future all companies will be public benefit corporations, or just phrased differently, what do you think a future looks like where we have substantially more companies as PBCs? And is that a future that we see happening?
Well, I was also going to say, having a front row seat now and watching the development of the new, well, can I go back to history for a second and tell Berkeley, because none of this is new. And there was somebody who was talking about the banking system and the requirement of community reinvestment. Exactly right. In the corporate law, the American Law Institute, First Principles of Corporate Governance, Mel Eisenberg from Berkeley has a whole chapter. This is, before Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, so they don't say the environmental, addressing exactly this, addressing how the structural design of a corporation may not, but should, if it is going to have long-term health, consider stakeholders and consider essentially the public benefit. So he was addressing this back in the 1970s, and then we can get into Sister Pat and all that kind of stuff. But so I am hopeful that this movement, you will either, well, I'm working on federal legislation, which will help, but I can't talk about that yet. At some point, you will be, more companies will be compelled to be PBCs, and even those that are not, the whole idea of shareholder primacy will be debunked. And in fact, the purpose of a normal corporation, if it is to return, good proceeds to its shareholders, will incorporate the public benefit. But we're not there yet. Amelia.
And I know that Suze knows this, but the American Law Institute right now is debating corporate purpose, but actually taking a far more conservative position than the version that Suze just discussed, and debating whether, taking a more of a shareholder-oriented view. I'll leave it at that because the debate goes on.
Thoughtful question, I think, for one of our students, I'll put out to the group, and maybe there's no answer, but it's an interesting thought experiment, although probably unlikely. But Tall asked, might the federal government require all companies to become PBCs at some point? Is that even possible? But then I think interesting framing here, seems like this would force companies as fictitious people to have some tangible connection to the real world that humans have to live in, where in the past corps have had the ability to ignore externalities, which is an interesting question dilemma. So does this get us towards that? Or it's a broad question, but maybe Professor Miazad, you think about these broad questions. Any insight here?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the public's expectations with respect to externalities, that is definitely changing. That is outside of the PBC, that is sort of the corporate purpose movement. And that's why most companies are moving to a more stakeholder-oriented view of purpose. On will the federal government do anything? Well, hopefully Suze can draft some amazing legislation. I'm really intrigued to hear more about that. But I do think that we often think about the shareholder-stakeholder debate as starting from Milton Friedman. But if you're a student of corporate governance history, as I know that Suze is, corporations have a long history and they have a long history of being public regarding. If you think about corporate purpose at the outset, it was to solve social problems such as transportation. Railroads were some of our earliest corporations. And these public benefits were enshrined in corporate charters. And we have, the pendulum has swung throughout the decades, but just for the past few decades, we've been trapped in this shareholder stakeholder paradigm. But we've imagined a different articulation and a pro-social articulation of corporate purpose many times in our history. And I think we're there again. And I think the thing that's pushing us there again is climate change.
And I would just say, I did meet with House Ways and Means a couple of weeks ago. So what I think, I do not see changing from state and corporation and putting this in the charter and moving away from that state power in at least in my lifetime. Maybe there's some students, but that's not going to happen. Using the tax code as we do to reward, nonprofit. Why do we have, public charities? Why do we have foundations? Using the tax code in a creative way to provide incentives for companies is and will be a very powerful way for the federal government to get involved in the debate, particularly at a time where corporate level taxes have to be increased.
Great. Well, I want to just, Josh, we're going to lose you. I'll get final thoughts from Professor Miazad and Suze, but Josh, thanks for your work on this. Folks, follow Veeva Systems. I think in the anniversary, you're planning to publish some blog posts and obviously some reporting that we'll be following closely. So thanks for your work on this and for being so open about the process.
Thank you all very much. Yeah, if anybody is in the process of converting or considering a conversion, you want to chat about your process, Adam has my contact info. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Josh. So final thoughts, Amelia or Suze. One interesting, folks are asking in the comments, what does this require now a company like Veeva to do? What changes? I'll throw that out there, but don't need to comment on that. But we'll let each of you give us a final thought, and then we'll say goodbye. Suze, we'll start with you.
A final thought. It is an exciting time to be a corporate lawyer, and really the power of being able to use corporate. Now we have law. In addition to these forms, a lot of other creative structures within corporate law to really affect change. And Adam, back to what you said, no, there's a lot of innovation. And if you have a fabulous idea, why not avail yourself of that innovation to accelerate that idea getting out into the market?
Amelia.
Something that Josh said really resonated with me, which is that it's important for companies to operate in a multi-stakeholder way, and just the process of converting, and you don't need to convert to a PBC to initiate these processes, allowed Veeva to have so much more information from its employees, from its shareholders, and that information helps it be a better company. And so I would say you don't need to transition to a public benefit corporation to set up those information gathering systems, and that will allow you to manage externalities, which is ultimately what shareholders and stakeholders want to see companies doing.
Well, thank you, Amelia and Susan, all of you out there for joining us this afternoon. Reminder, any issues, contact us at executive@law.berkeley.edu. Final plug in the chat box. We've got our MCLE link, but also the links to register for our 2 executive courses in ESG and sustainability, Sustainable Capitalism, ESG Online. That's kind of our doctrinal, larger course in this. And then we have a shorter course focused on the board's role that we've partnered with Series on, ESG Navigating the Board's Role. Both are available for registration. Every past cohort of these courses have sold out, so if you're interested, definitely check those out. Thank you again, everyone, for spending your morning or afternoon or evening with us. Have a safe rest of your week.